Good afternoon and welcome, everyone. My name is Sammy Kahn. I'm the Executive Director of the Council on Science and Technology at Princeton University, and it's my pleasure to welcome you to our continuing Nature of Evidence series. In a moment, I'll be introducing our very own Assistant Director, Dr. Paul Durst, who will be speaking today with Dr. Emily Oster, our esteemed guest. Today's series, I have to say, is very much in line with what we do at the Council on Science and Technology in Princeton, because we're all about advancing STEM literacy at the university and beyond. We do this in so many ways, including robust STEM courses, research, and events throughout the year. If you're interested, and I hope you are, I hope you'll check out our website at cst.princeton.edu for more information. And now I'd love to turn the program over to Paul. And have a great time. Bye-bye. Paul, over to you.
Thanks, Sammy. Hi, everyone, and welcome. So this series seeks to understand how different fields conduct research and what evidence means to their disciplines. So how do we know about the atmosphere on Venus? What can residue on pottery shards tell us about ancient Rome? When can you actually project a winner in an election? This year, in the midst of pandemic, protests over racial injustice, and a heated presidential contest, the topic seems all the more relevant. 2 weeks ago, the CST hosted our biannual Living at the Intersection Symposium with the theme of truth and evidence. A wonderful group of keynote speakers and panelists discussed how data are collected, analyzed, and communicated. And as with any good symposium, this raised as many good questions as it answered. Tonight, we have the opportunity to continue that discussion and ask some of those questions to our speaker. I'm extremely excited to have the privilege of introducing Dr. Emily Oster. Dr. Oster did her undergraduate and graduate work at Harvard University, where she received her PhD in economics. She's currently the Royce Family Professor of Teaching Excellence and Professor of Economics at Brown University. As a health economist, Dr. Oster is interested in why people do not always make the rational health choices, and she has studied a wide range of topics, including HIV and sexual behavior in Africa, gender equality in healthcare in India, the health and financial decisions made by people who may or may not have Huntington's disease, and even medieval witchcraft. In addition to her academic research, Dr. Oster has written 2 books. Her first book, Expecting Better, explores the data behind many common pregnancy rules with the aim of helping pregnant women make more informed decisions. Her second book, Crib Sheet, does the same for early childhood. As a relatively new father, as well as someone who found spreadsheets of election return data to be incredibly soothing over the past week, Dr. Oster's books have been an amazing resource over the last year. I could spend half a day going deep into the literature to get some shallow understanding of how dangerous caffeine is during pregnancy or the benefits of breastfeeding after 6 months, but Dr. Oster did all of that work for me, and she presented it in a fun and accessible form to enjoy. Last year, Dr. Oster began writing a bi-weekly newsletter called Parent Data that focuses on evidence-based parenting. It quickly gained a cult-like following from parents frantically trying to understand the latest sensationalized headlines about journal articles reporting the dangers of just about anything to infants and pregnant women. I invited Dr. Oster to give this talk in February because of my interest in her work, but that work has become all the more relevant with the rise of COVID-19. Her newsletter was one of the few reliable sources of information for parents early on, and she has since co-founded the COVID Explained website, a resource for information about COVID-19 with particular relevance for parents. She's penned articles in the New York Times, the Washington Post, and the Atlantic, and appeared on countless podcasts and news programs to help explain the difficult decisions parents face in the midst of the pandemic. So, with the incredible amount of confusion surrounding COVID-19, Dr. Oster has become a trusted voice for those seeking to understand the evidence, and we're so excited to have her with us tonight. Please join me in welcoming Dr. Emily Oster.
Thank you. That was so nice. I'm super excited to be here and talk to you guys. I will apologize in advance if there's any loud yelling in the background. My kids are running around somewhere behind me, which is perhaps fitting for this talk. So I want to talk a little bit about, ultimately I want to talk about some of the work I've been doing about COVID in schools and sort of how we collect evidence there. But I want to build a little bit into that and tell you a little bit about kind of how I came to sort of the particular place I am with evidence collecting in the pandemic. And so I'm gonna share my screen because I have a few slides. But I thought, first, maybe it would be useful, since usually I talk to, let's see, is there a way to, nope, sorry, I actually don't know. I know how to screen share, but not how my computer works. Let's present, okay. All right, so I thought it'd be useful to tell you a little bit about me. So I'm an economist and a writer, I guess, and I really, like, a lot of what I do is think about how to kind of present evidence to a broad audience. But my academic work is actually mostly focused on sort of statistical methodology. So to give you a sense, the kind of last paper that I wrote before the pandemic, the last paper I published is about the limits of observational data in a world in which individuals are making kind of endogenous choices about their health behaviors. And I also have written a couple of books about parenting and pregnancy. And the kind of purpose of those books is really to sort of help people think about what the evidence says around some of these parts of parenting and pregnancy that are so fraught, things like breastfeeding or sleep training, or can I have a cup of coffee while I'm pregnant? And so when the pandemic had sort of started up, I was writing, as Paul said, I was writing a newsletter about well, it was supposed to be about data on parenting. But then it kind of rapidly evolved into a newsletter about data on kids and pregnancy and parenting in the era of COVID. And so first it was just, I think initially it was just a lot of fear about, how high risk are kids, how worried should I be about my kids. So I was writing a lot about that. But then as it sort of has become clear, and actually became clear pretty early on, that kids are not a very high risk group themselves. People started thinking a lot more about the kind of some of the auxiliary negative impacts on kids, particularly around sort of learning losses and childcare losses and developmental milestone losses, and kind of how we should think about those choices. And I started thinking a lot about those. And so I'm going to tell you a little bit about some of the data that I sort of collected and put together on some of these questions. But I want to start by kind of setting the stage a little bit for why I think this is so important, and why I think in particular the question of schools is so important. So this is a graph that somebody put together, actually a colleague of mine, John Friedman, and his co-authors put together early in the pandemic about learning. So as you probably know, in March, more or less every school shut down. So more or less every school in America, more or less every school in America shut down. And there was not a lot of in-person schooling. There was a lot of remote schooling. And this is, there's a question of like, how much learning loss was there really from those, from that change? And so this is a graph that looks at data from a company called Zern, which makes an online math program that tracks what's nice about it is it tracks in real time kind of how things are going, and it tracks kids like every day. And what you can see is that this is basically where the pandemic shut everything down. And you can see that the speed with which students are learning, which is measured here by these badges, the speed with which the students are learning is totally tanks after March, and then it sort of slowly comes back, but really not anywhere close to where it would have been otherwise. And that these drops are much larger in middle and lower income areas, as much as 50 to 70% learning loss. Now we've seen some similar kinds of things in the fall. So it's been a bit better in the fall, I think. But still we're seeing huge changes in literacy rates in, for example, Washington, D.C. And so for all of these reasons, I think it is really imperative that we think about how we can safely get kids back to in-person school. And I started thinking about this in, June, or March or April, as soon as it became clear that we were not going back to in-person schooling in the spring, I started thinking about, okay, what are the steps that are going to get us back to in-person schooling in the fall? And one of the things I sort of thought, I am a person who loves evidence, who loves data, who feels very strongly that that's kind of the answer to how we're going to figure out what is the, what are we going to do? And so I thought, okay, well, in this time period, we actually are seeing some kids in childcare settings. So even during the kind of height of the kind of panic in the spring, there were still a lot of kids in in-person childcare settings, for children of essential workers in particular. And then as things sort of moved through the summer, we actually started to see some camps, some daycares, reopen. I thought those are really an opportunity. They're an opportunity to learn how things are going. How are we gonna, this is a place that we can get evidence, we can get data about what is actually, what are the risks likely to be to kids when we start, thinking about going back to school. And so I actually kept saying this. Paul points out I'm on a lot of podcasts. I go on a lot of podcasts. And when people ask me about this on podcasts, I would say, oh, this is such a great opportunity to learn about all this stuff. Like, I'm sure somebody's collecting data. And it sort of became clear as I was thinking about that actually nobody was collecting this data. And so I said, I'm sure the government is collecting this data. No, I'm sure the state government's collecting the data. Not really. Are there academics collecting this data? Well, sort of, but they're kind of planning to publish it sometime in November. Well, November is really late. People need to make these decisions about childcare now, and they need to make the decisions about schooling in the early fall or in August. And so I eventually sort of got really frustrated, and I posted on my newsletter, which is literally just a newsletter that I send to people who have subscribed. I posted, let's get together some data, let's crowdsource some data on childcare, which is, and I just want to be clear, like, as a person whose entire professional life at the moment is about like the limits of evidence and observational data and selection, it is really odd to sort of think, okay, I'm just going to literally try to collect data using a newsletter that I personally publish. But at the time, there was really like nothing else. And so actually what I did with my newsletter is this is a Google form. I made a Google form. The purpose of the form is to crowdsource information on kids and COVID. And people would just put some data in this form. They would I ended up partnering with some different websites, and some basically childcare providers would say, okay, I'm running a childcare and this is how many kids I have, and this is what's happening. And then I just posted this data. And so this is from some kind of an earlier version of this, in which there's basically, we have like 630 childcare centers serving 15,000 kids, and here are some kind of infection rates in children and staff. And so, this is really limited data, and we can sort of talk about the issues with it, of which there are many. But it was, at the time that I put this out, basically the only data like this that was available. And so in that sense, like, there was a sort of realization of like, well, there's something we can, some evidence, something that we can sort of draw on, at least as a benchmark, at least as a place to start. As we actually got better data on this, it seemed like this was actually roughly right. The kind of subsequent data that's come out, despite being substantially better, is roughly in line with what I found in this period. So that was kind of my first foray into this data space. And then as the pandemic kind of evolved, we got to a point at the end of the summer where I realized that we were having sort of the same experience with schools, that by that time everyone had kind of accepted that childcare centers were fine, but then schools started to open, and the kinds of evidence that were coming out on schools, the kind of evidence was very limited. So we were seeing anecdotal reports. here is a school that had a big outbreak. You remember, if you were sort of following this, like in early August, a bunch of schools in Georgia opened. They opened in a place with a really high positivity rate. And people were just like, it was like, this is a terrible idea. And there were these pictures of like, these really crowded hallways. And then there was, the school has to close for 2 weeks because these people have COVID. And it sort of became this, like, there was like a lot of discussion about that. And then there were people who were like, hey, actually, it's going fine. And it was sort of hard to navigate because, of course, there was no data. There was no report out on, somebody has sort of said there are 6 cases here, but like, is there really 6 cases? Like, what exactly is going on? And so I sort of started talking again to people that, hey, we're not collecting this data. We should be collecting this data. And so the job of collecting data on schools was, of course, too big for my trusty Google form. And I partnered with a group, a number of different groups, the Superintendents Associations and Principals Associations, the company Qualtrics, actually able to like stand up a real dashboard, not just like this is a Google sheet that I've colored so it looks professional. They have a real professional approach to this. And we started what we're calling the COVID-19 School Response Dashboard. So the way this is working at the moment is we are enrolling schools or school districts and asking them to provide us some baseline information on their mode of opening, on how many kids they have in person, how many staff they have in person, and then we follow up with them regularly to ask them how many COVID cases they have. So it's a really, really simple idea. It's basically what I think that we should be doing in some broader federal sense. But we're doing it kind of on an individual, in a sort of individual way. And what we're doing with it is we're posting it publicly in a sort of pretty much real time kind of way. So the idea is to really move from, honestly, the kind of evidence production that I'm feeling more comfortable with as an academic, where you get your evidence and you pour over it, and in 2023 you publish it, into more of like, I got some evidence from 3 weeks ago and it's up on the website right now, in the hopes that it can actually be used to help people make some decisions. So let me show you a little bit actually about what the dashboard looks like, and then I'll try to give you a couple of sort of high level takeaways, and then I'll let you ask questions. So hopefully you can see this. Paul, can I just get you to unmute for a second and make sure that you can see the dashboard?
Yep, you can see it.
Awesome. So this is a dashboard, and it is, you can sort of, the kind of high level picture here is we're sort of looking at confirmed case rates in students and staff. And we're quoting these in actually two different ways. So first, the sort of first way is just case rates per, like just a rate per in a 2-week period. So this number in the most recent period is like 0.9 infections per 1,000 students over 2 weeks. So about 1 infection in a class of in a school of 1,000 over that 2-week period. This number is about 2 infections among 1,000 staff over that period. Those infection rates are perhaps not themselves sort of that interesting without a benchmark. So I think in some ways more useful are these 2 graphs on daily case rates. So if you sort of listen to the discussions, the zeitgeisty discussion about COVID, you usually see community rates quoted in cases per 100,000 per day. And so we've actually converted our school case rates into those numbers, and then overlaid on top of that the community case rates in numbers. So you can see over here, and we can come back to this, you can see over here the basically the community rates and the school rates are kind of moving together. The student rates are a bit lower than the overall community, and the staff rates are kind of similar, maybe in this period a bit higher. If you scroll down, you can see the count of students. And so one of the things you'll see is we'd like to always be improving. And so the dashboard got a lot bigger between the sort of 3rd wave and the 4th wave. And that's actually really important for us. So one of the big concerns about this type of data collection method is the selection in who is involved. So we go out and we ask districts to be involved, but of course the kind of districts that are involved really, and we would like to kind of better address that. And so in this most recent wave, we actually were able to pull in all of the data from the state of New York. So that's basically every kind of the state of New York reports out on their website the cases in every school. And so we pull off we pull all of those in. We pull all of those in the most recent period. So here we have 1.6 million kids in in-person school and a total of 3 million in the data set. So if I can put this at some point in the chat if I can figure out how to do that. But you can also go here and do all kinds of fun stuff to sort of filter around. So you can exclude schools that have high school in them, and you can see the rates drop a little bit. Now they're 4 rather than 6. And you can exclude schools that don't have a high school, and now the rates go up a lot. So that's one of the sort of most significant things that are kind of uncovered by this data here is the difference between high schools and say elementary or middle schools. That high schools are really substantially higher risk than schools with younger kids. So I will leave you at some point to play around with this on your own. I want to sort of go back and kind of talk a little bit about big picture takeaways. So sort of like, what is the data? What are sort of, how might we organize the data? So I think one very clear takeaway is this issue of age that we're seeing. Seeing that younger kids are lower risk than older kids. But the other, really kind of simple way to organize the data is to note that the case rates in the schools really line up with the case rates in the community. So here we're kind of trying to show that directly using only the data from New York, where our data is really comprehensive. So this is what economists would call a bin scatter, which may be less familiar with to other disciplines. But so this is basically so we have data at the zip code level, which I have it at the school level, we like aggregated up to the zip code level. And we've divided areas into into bins based on the community rate. So these are, these are the zip codes with the lower rates, and then going up to the higher rates. And we've graphed the average case rate in that bin in the community. That's on the x-axis, and on the y-axis is the case rates among students and staff. And so here the orange dots are the staff, and the yellow dots are high school students. And here the blue dots are elementary and middle school students. And so basically what you see here is that, whatever is the rate in the community, it is being reflected. In the school. And the sort of older people in the school are kind of reflecting exactly that rate, and the younger people in the school are reflecting a bit of a lower rate, very likely consistent with the fact that younger people are less likely to be infected than older people, just in general. The other thing that we sort of pull out of this data is something about the distribution. So this is the distribution of number of cases across schools in the New York data. So about 80% of the schools have no cases over this 2-week period. But of the schools that have cases over this period, about 90% of those have either 1 or 2 cases. So small numbers of cases that look, like they're probably isolated or not a result of spread within the school. So between this and sort of other data that's kind of generally coming out here, we're kind of coming away from at least this initial phase of data collection, with it sort of starting to look like the schools are not themselves major sources of COVID spread. And that, of course, has led, and then I'll conclude and let see if people have questions. It sort of led to people asking the question, well, what should the threshold be for opening? Should we open more schools? Should we open fewer schools? So I will say, my read of the data here suggests that we should have more schools should be open than are. That in particular, in a lot of low prevalence areas, elementary schools are not open. I think that's probably not right. I think probably more elementary schools should be open. I think the sort of exactly where you draw the line and where should we stop opening is a little unclear. I will say, I think that this is kind of an important point to make, that the main way that we can prevent spread in schools is to control spread in the community. That is kind of got to be the key. And so if we're thinking about, how are we going to combat this in schools? How are we going to lower rates in schools? The answer is probably not close schools, but rather, close bars or close restaurants or do other measures, stop getting together in small gatherings in people's houses. Do things that will sort of lower the rate in the community, and that will be reflected in lower rates in schools. At least I think that is what the data is telling us at this fairly early stage. So Paul, let me stop there and see if we want to have some questions or.
Sure. And so I should mention to everyone that we have a question and answer box. Feel free to type in your questions. I will take in the questions and try to put them together if they seem related in some way. But I'm happy to take as many questions as we have time for in the next 30 minutes or so. Let's see. First question. In your data collection for schools, are there certain types of schools that are over or underrepresented? I mean, either in terms of elementary, high school, or private, public. Is this all public data or public school data, or is this a mix of them?
So this is a mix, and you can actually filter by public-private in the data. Most of the data in there is district public school data, and I think the selection issues are like absolutely paramount. So in particular, when we have a sort of opt-in sample, we have more higher income like suburban public schools than the sort of like relative to like the number of Title I schools in the data. So this is something we are working on. I think we're working on it, and sort of the main way we're working on it is we're trying to pull in sort of larger tranches of data that would be more representative. So the New York data is one good example of this, where we actually have every school in New York. So that includes a lot of places that are not high income. In the next round of the data, I think we'll have a lot of data from Texas, again, which in sort of a more comprehensive kind of way. We're working with some charter school networks to try to pull in like a large amount of charter school data, which will also sort of pull in more lower income Title I schools. So we're trying hard to kind of push in these directions of more representative data, because it's absolutely, this is absolutely an issue in the data. I will say, I think what we're seeing is pretty consistent with what kind of overall people are seeing, but this is the number one priority in this data collection effort at the moment.
This is a question sort of about the unknown unknowns, but without widespread testing, we don't have a good sense necessarily of asymptomatic people who may be who are sort of missing from this data. Do you have any sense that that this could be impacting the results in some way, or that maybe there's if younger children are less likely to be infected, is that less likely overall versus asymptomatic? And could they still be sort of small spreads of asymptomatic children or something like that?
Sure. Yeah. So I mean, I think we know that we know that kids are more likely to be asymptomatic. They're generally less likely to be infected, but also more likely to be asymptomatic. There are places, New York is the most notable, where they are doing some testing in schools, some sort of like random testing, and that is generally showing up quite low rates. So the sort of like idea that somehow all the kids have COVID and we just don't know, I think is not supported by at least that data. I would very much like to see more of that. I think that's actually a really important open question. And I think it is part of what has kept teachers afraid of returning, is this idea that somehow like a ton of asymptomatic kids are just like running around. I think if we used some of our kind of less expensive screening tests, like these Benex tests, to try to address some of that, I think that would be really helpful in sort of promoting more school opening. I will say, in places, the other way you would sort of see evidence of that is if when we opened schools, then there were like huge amounts of community spread. I think the best data on that is coming out of at the moment Germany and Spain, where actually we're not seeing community spread sort of being driven by school opens. And so I think that's a little bit complicated, whether that's exactly how you want to interpret that result, but I think that it's certainly consistent with that idea.
Thanks. So I think that, there is a question about some of the things that your dashboard might take into consideration. And I'm looking at your dashboard, and I'm just quick question: does it have an easy to remember link name, or is it really this long?
It does, but it's not. I don't remember what it is.
Okay.
And so, but there is. So I will wait. I'm going to put in the chat.
Okay.
To everyone, I'm going to put the link to the dashboard, the full dashboard, but there's also a full dashboard.com, which is like the landing page, which links to the broader dashboard.
Okay, great. Yeah, and if you if you go to the parent data website, you have
right.
that big,
yes,
big.
It's all over.
So, but sort of related. So I know that one of the filtering capabilities is for students to be wearing masks. But what about sort of the community mask mandates?
Right. So I think the simplest way to do that is to probably filter by state. So we, or to limit to some states with sort of lower, and you definitely see that in the places where people are not required to wear masks at the state level, the rates in schools are higher, the rates in the communities are higher. And I think that's sort of a complicated, that's kind of a complicated, it's hard to interpret what that exactly means, whether it's in fact the masks, which we know help, or whether it's all the other things that they're doing. I think part of that question was about kind of places where there are bars and restaurants. So that's actually almost every place. So there's every place in the US has some kind of restaurant opening, I think. And so there's certainly a lot of places, California, Boston, places in Massachusetts where there are a lot of services of that type open, and there are still no schools open. And so we have some data from those places, although it's mostly from remote learners because they're not in person.
Yeah. So I think one of the interesting questions is with this, I think that all schools were shut down at a time when COVID rate was, across the board, it was rising and all of this. But, the idea of when schools should remain open versus when they should close down. Now, I know that you're not sort of making these broad statements about that and necessarily, but you are arguing that maybe we're being a little cautious right now, but I just would be interested to hear your thoughts sort of expanded upon on that idea of sort of.
I think the way that I'm thinking about this is more about ranking schools relative to other things, rather than sort of having some kind of like rule that you should only be open in certain circumstances, right? So I think that one of the questions in here is somebody has asked is, should schools always be open in as long as the rates are kind of like the community? And I think that's kind of the right way to, I think, ask the question, which is, if we think about it as a community, there are some things that are very low risk, the high benefit, like, I don't know, hiking or something, where probably we should have hiking trails open because that's basically a low risk activity that some people enjoy. And there is, some things we should put on kind of the other end, like large indoor concerts, which, are really dangerous and definitely an opportunity to spread COVID. And then there's sort of things in the middle where we can imagine, that schools are kind of seems to be like a fairly low risk, high benefit activity. And that is why I would say that they should be open if we're going to open other things. So rather than saying, like, I think a reasonable view is like, we're in a situation right now where we just need to lock down and nothing can be open. and we can't have restaurants or bars or hair salons or, indoor gyms or, like going to gatherings of 15 people or whatever it is. And I think if we're going to say that, then the next thing you might close is schools. But to sort of say all those other things are okay and schools should be closed, I think that's not where I would rank those things. And again, that's sort of a personal, like other people may have a different kind of view about where things are importance. But I think that's kind of the dimension on which I would want this debate to happen. Not so much, should it be open or should it, but just like, we're find somewhere. And I think that the schools should be kind of near the top of that list of things to open, which is, to be fair, what Europe has done. They basically said, we're going back to lockdown. It's going to be essential, grocery stores, hospitals, schools. That's I'm kind of into that. I'm kind of personally, I'm kind of into that.
Yeah. So I mean, I think this dashboard is a work in progress, right?
That's for sure.
And so there's a question about, does this one doesn't have maps
right.
to sort of show the distribution of where the data are collected.
So you can see the states. You can filter to states, and one could in principle make maps with that. And then for New York, you can actually download the raw data because we just scrape that so it's public. But for the rest of it, we have not. We one of the things we told districts was we will not identify you. And people have come back and said, oh, well, that's like totally ridiculous. Like they should have to identify themselves. But like that's not for us to do, I think. And so in order to get higher quality data and have districts be willing to report data to us, and be willing to tell us the truth, the kind of cost of that, I think, is some privacy. And as we've talked to states, some of them have said like it's like it is helpful that you have this, that you can sort of have this kind of privacy because maybe you can get some data for us that they won't give us, and then you can at least tell us like how many people in our state have COVID, which apparently some states don't yet know.
Yeah, that's terrifying.
Yes, I agree. Some of these conversations are truly like surprising.
Yeah. I'm interested a little bit in just sort of, you've taken on this role as a data collector when this did not exist, and sort of, I think that part of the struggle has been this lack of data on this from the national level down. I mean, so what do you? I mean, is that the role? Should that be the role of researchers? Should that be the role of what are your? I mean,
yeah.
Is this? Can there be a partnership? Should this be solely falling on the national governments to be collecting? I mean, just sort of interested in.
Yeah, I mean, I definitely don't think it should be my job. And so we can all agree that's not good. I mean, I think part of what has been, I think part of what's really hard is the information about this is very fragmented. And so, I think some states have kind of come around to sort of doing versions of this. But I think it's been really difficult for them because actually, in many cases, states don't have the kind of information they would need for this. So a lot of the decisions about this are vested at the superintendent level or at the school district level. So I'll come to states, I'll say, hey, it would be great to know how many in-person learners there are. And they're like, well, we have no idea. We don't have that information. Not all states, but some states definitely are in that. Or, I'd why aren't you asking your schools for the COVID numbers? Well, they're not really going to tell us. We wouldn't. And so I think that there was a space for some federal leadership on this. It's obviously not impossible because we have collected a reasonable amount of data, and some states are reporting this. It's not that one couldn't do this. And I think that it would have been better to have this organized out of the CDC or something where there would both have been more of a mandate. So even if not everybody reported in, you would get some more reporting in because people would feel like they kind of needed to because it was an actual government asking them to do it. I think that would have been better. And I'm not sure why that didn't happen. I assume it's related to could be anything, but general federal leadership challenges. Let's put it that way.
So, I mean, COVID up to this point has had a really regionalized distribution of cases, with hotspots picking up in different places. And I think that the dashboard as it looks right now has a lot of data in some places and not as much in others. Is there do you think that generalizations can be made, or that you can fill in the gaps even if there aren't data for a specific area at the given time? Anything like
Yeah,
that?
I mean, I think that I see the value of this in some sense, sort of learning about in kind of more generally what is going on in this space. And so I think we may be able to ultimately draw some conclusions about like some of these measures schools are taking. So we did ask questions about masking and ventilation and those kind of things, and we can sort of look at some of those at least correlations. We'll be able to again sort of dive into this kind of link between the community rates and the school rates. I think that's pretty useful. I don't think we need data from the entire US to do that, although we clearly need more than we have now. What this is never going to be, I think, at least not while I'm running it, is a sort of way that you can like look up your school district and see exactly how it's doing. And I don't think that's not really what this is. That's not really what this kind of data is for anyway. Like, we should have another mechanism where people can learn what is going on in their district. I think this is more about sort of like generally understanding how we manage the pandemic. For that, it would be good to have more systematic data from some more heavily affected areas. And I think hopefully we'll start getting that. We're having a lot of conversations with individual states about this.
Yeah, great. So there's this question about the costs of having kids at home, and has there been work done on that? I think there's some. And can you talk to that?
Yeah, I mean, I think people have started to sort of think about, I think a lot of that has kind of so far focused on the labor market cost of just women being out of the labor force. That there's been like a large drop in labor force participation among prime age women, which most people think is kind of a result of the sort of need for one parent to be home for some kind of homeschooling situation. And so I think that's been kind of that's been an issue that we've seen sort of people start at least to talk about. But I don't think we're ever, it's going to be a long time before we have the sort of true numbers of the kind of long-term impacts of these disruptions on people's careers.
Yeah. So I think there are two questions here sort of about the different rules and the implementations of rules and different types of tests and everything like that. I mean, some districts require, a single negative test. Some, have a quarantine regardless of negative tests, things like that. Can we get at how those types of implications may have impacts for COVID spread?
So, yeah, I mean, I will say this is the biggest complaint that we get from schools. If you sort of ask the schools, like, this is the problem that they have, is that they have to quarantine everybody, and they're quarantining people all the time, and their rules are weird, and like it's not really like they have to quarantine them for 14 days, but like actually like I don't know that like they nobody's converting, and then they want to quarantine them for less time. The CDC said maybe 10 days is okay. It's just sort of like it's gone over and over, and they're trying to figure this out. Again, I think this is an incredible opportunity for data. It's a little bit different than the kind of data that we're collecting, but it's like a real opportunity. Like many places are doing this and tracking it well, both K-12 schools, but also universities, right? We're quarantining people all the time. We have an opportunity to see, how quickly they're converting, who is converting at what time, how many people. And I think that is clearly interesting, useful data. It is the kind of evidence that I think should go into what we really ultimately need, which is like to give schools a plan, right? The fact that every school district in America, which there are 13,000, are developing effectively their own personal COVID plan is crazy. I mean, forget about, it's one thing to say we should have better reporting in, but just basic things about like, how should you deal with this? There's like tons of these, all of these schools are just, this isn't their thing. They're not like, I don't know, pandemic, like this is not like prepare for a pandemic. They don't know how to do this. And so I think we just need to be able to tell people like, okay, this is what you should do. This is how you should use the testing. This is how you should do quarantine. Like, and if we did that, then if we had like a generic plan, then after we learned what is the right amount of quarantine, we just be like, hey, update to the generic plan that you're already doing. Now quarantine is 6 days. or now quarantine is 6 days in a test, or whatever it is. And we sort of push that out. And in the absence of that, we have sort of 13,000 different plans, which require different amounts of quarantine and different amounts of isolation and different testing procedures, and just like a total mess.
Yeah. Yeah. And as we've learned more, those things have changed, and everything is set in stone, and you can't go back and change it. Yeah.
Exactly. Yeah.
So that graph you showed about learning drops in March. I was interested in, has that continued on, sort of paying attention to that? Has that increased since then? Like, I mean, as schools go back, does that increase the learning, or was there something about sort of being in pandemic that has sort of impacted learning outcomes as well?
So it's a bit better in the fall than it was. So it's down from where it was kind of in February now, but it is up from where it was in April, I would say. So like there's been, I think clearly, I think everyone who has experienced this would agree that our ability to do distance learning and like remote learning has gotten better since, in the fall, because people had minimally more time to plan it out. Right. But I think it's also pretty clear that, remote learning is not working for a lot of students. And we're losing a lot of students, particularly low-income students, who are just not showing up, or who are dropping out, or who never enrolled, or who don't come to their Zooms. And I think that is a major concern, and we're starting to see it even in some early DC data on literacy and stuff. So
yeah. Okay. And so, I mean, there's a question about a steep decline for high income areas. I may not.
It's hard to interpret the Zern data kind of after May because places just stopped. Like they just were like, the school year's over.
Yeah. Can you speak a little bit to the sort of impact of the disproportional sort of impact on low income students? What the long-term consequences of that might look like? I don't know if you have any.
Yeah, I don't know. We know that like these kind of like learning losses are, have like long-term impacts. How large are they going to be? I mean, I think one thing that people have sort of talked about is this like summer melt, where it's kind of like you lose a lot, but it's like bigger, like a summer melt, but bigger. But I think that there's also, worries about like kids who are in high school, that like sort of anyone who's kind of marginally attached to school completion may just detach. And then, the difference between kind of graduating high school and not graduating high school and your long-term lifetime income is really big. That's a really big number. So, if we sort of lose some people in that space, that's going to be, that's going to be really bad. And I think we're just not going to know how big that is for another 30 years.
Yeah. There is a question a little bit about sort of economists versus biological researchers. And I'm a little interested, just sort of, there's, in terms of the work that you're doing with this, I don't think that you would consider yourself, a public health policy necessarily, right, or a biological researcher or anything like that. How does that interplay between different disciplines and sort of the different evidence that you might get from those disciplines? How does that work together?
So I talk a lot to biologists, but ultimately some of this stuff, school stuff, that's really like that's more in like the economist wheelhouse. Yeah. But also this is really just data. I mean, I think that in the end, like the sort of data is kind of data is just like what it is. It is not discipline specific. There is nothing sort of special about means or selection that's somehow like special to economists or special to biologists. I mean, I think that the kind of lens that we're going to bring to this stuff is different. I think economists are probably more into like trade-offs, and like that's like our thing. And so I think I'm going to kind of comment this with more of a kind of trade-off lens than some other people. And then some other people would, but but certainly there are like science on the COVID Explained team. There's like tons of like real scientists who think about real science. Tell me things about real science.
Can you talk a little bit about the bias in both this school dashboard, the daycares? This is all self-reported data. What kind of biases are being introduced as a result of that?
I mean, I think that it's going to mostly introduce biases in favor of sort of lower lower rates, which I think is partly why, it's useful to have kind of some of these places where you have more comprehensive data, and where also, it's good to kind of look outside of the of this data into other data, sort of see how much does this line up with the other data that we're seeing. And so I mean, I think that's kind of like the likely direction of the bias. In the case of the daycare data, like I think that was like potentially way more biased, right? That was like such an extreme, that felt to me like such an extreme amount of bias, because it was like, I don't know what the universe is, like who are these people who are filling out this Google form, but actually those numbers turned out to be like really good. And so I think, there was a sort of like in this, I'm not sure the biases in practice are as large as they might seem to be, or as I might have been worried about that they would be in ex ante. But this is a place that we just keep trying to push, and we just keep trying to like figure out how can we get better, how can we do better. That's the goal.
Yeah,
do better.
I was really surprised that a group of sort of particularly need to be informed parents reporting on their own daycares would sort of reflect the national population.
Yeah, I mean, I was surprised too. I don't know, I was surprised. I mean, I think part of what's good about the school stuff, and we did some in the daycare stuff also, was we were sort of we're tracking over time. So there is a sort of opportunity to see kind of, and we have like pretty, at least in school day, we have like quite good fidelity. Like people, once they start doing it, then they just do it, because the baseline data is a lot of work. And so then once you've done that, like we've kind of selected some people who like are willing to fill out some spreadsheets. So I think that's been good. So we'll see.
Do the colleges give us anything useful to learn about the general population? They seem like an even sort of stranger sample than.
Yeah, I think the colleges are, we're seeing a sort of like mix of a mix of places for colleges. I think we're seeing some places are doing really well, and those tend to be really selective places that are doing like a ton of testing and doing all kinds of other stuff, and then some places are doing kind of poorly. And they are also places that aren't doing as much testing, but also they're, sort of selected in like their behavioral selection is kind of in other ways. So I think that's a hard population to learn. Also, this is a much higher risk group, like of people, the college students, than the non-college.
Right. Has this experience given you any sort of takeaways for how you collect data, how you look at data sort of moving forward? Is this just
no?
Sort of
I mean, it feels so different. It just feels like such a different like way of approaching like evidence than I have done before. I mean, I think it has reminded me that some of the ways that we work are a little slow, and that sometimes people need to know things right now, and you sort of need to. I think this experience a lot of people say they have when they go to DC, that like you realize like, okay, sometimes you have to make decisions like right away, and you cannot wait for like the perfect data. And so I think there's a sort of piece of that that's kind of come out for me, that like, you cut like there's a little bit of that coming out, but mostly it just feels so different that I'm just like,
Yeah. I have an in the weeds question if there aren't any other questions, but just sort of the business of college.
We can end with an in the weeds question, and right? I gotta go make dinner.
Maybe it's esoteric, I don't know, but the idea of publishing quickly, or like putting the data out there and putting it, and that does not jive with the model of academia. And
that is true.
Do you have thoughts on that?
I will, yeah. So I think the biggest thought I have on that is when I was doing this childcare stuff, everybody was like, oh, there's a guy at Yale. He's already collecting this data. It's great. So I wrote to him. I was like, hey, like, you're collecting this data. It's so great. And he was like, yeah, I'm gonna release it. And like, he did release it eventually in November. But by then, like, this had moved on. Like, I mean, it was great. It was like really nice data, but like people needed to know then. And I think that is, I think this is just like, this kind of approach that we often take is not well suited for this moment in some ways. In some ways, very well, we've learned a lot of things from science, but there are some pieces of it that are not well suited. And I think it's like, it's hard. I find it weird to be like, okay, I'm just going to put this up. But like, I think, this is the data that we have. And it also, by putting it up, you get better data. Right. So when we put up this dashboard and people see it, then states call and they say, hey, I'm going to give you my data. Like, what, how can we work together? So then the data gets better. And if you don't put it up, then you don't get that.
Yeah. Speaking of in the moment, you talked a little bit about being an economist and a cost benefit analysis and all of this kind of thing. And this is, I think this is a good question. I may be biased because it's my father asking the question, but people who belong to high risk groups being told, that this, that their infection risk is at the level of the community, but they're being told to go back. Does the cost benefit model still sort of work there? I mean, I realize it sort of falls apart at the individual level sometimes, but I'm interested.
I think that, I think what we could say there is, of course, like there are going to be people who cannot go to work, and then we are going to like work out. We need to have opportunities to work out, how can we help them organize their, how can we help them sort of support them even when they don't, when they can't go back to work. And, I think we're just going to have to work that out on an individual basis.
Yeah. Okay. Well, if there are no other questions, I mean, I think that's close to all the time.
Thank you.
Thank you so much for everything. This was a really great way to think about some of the anxieties I think that we're all experiencing at the moment, and tackle those with now I have another dashboard I can look at
exactly another dashboard.
So
all right, thank you so much. I really appreciate it.
Yeah, thank you so much, and thank you everyone who came, and we will have more announcements about this series as it moves forward. So thank you all for coming.